Welcome. Welcome back to Sikistan and welcome back to S&C Coaches React. Today we're reacting to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson's training video. So just before we get going again, we've noticed sometimes with the combat sports athletes can be a little bit precious, a little bit defensive in the comments. So really want to emphasize that we're just doing this as a great teaching tool, because teaching things in context is so much more effective than doing theory. And we do try and do theory, and we'll do more in the future, of course, but using things in context is always a great way of teaching people things, because it's like an analogy you have right in front of you, and it's really easy to see what we're talking about. Okay, so we're not picking on Wonderboy Thompson, we're not picking on his coach. It just so happens that they had a full-length training video up. They gave context what they were doing in the session, so they said exactly what's going on. And it's a great example of what we see so many combat sports athletes doing in their training. It literally could not be a better example. And we're going to run through why it's not great.
No, this is a nice little microcosm for a lot of the issues we see with combat athletes. Now, it's not that just combat athletes have issues with their training. To be honest, most sports, if we were to look into some training videos, there are some inadequacies or just places where people get a bit mixed up and turned around. And as Gareth said, this is in no way picking on one person in particular. This video just so happens to have a few of the talking points we wanted in it, and it fits in quite nicely.
So they're starting off with some warm-up. So literally anything you can do as a warm-up, as long as it's just general body weight stuff. They're throwing a boomerang, a three-armed boomerang.
Looks like a boppet.
A little boppet. So this is actually, I really like this kind of stuff as warm-up, especially for athletes like this who need extreme hand-eye coordination. So this is, I've no problem with this. I think you could literally do no end of this.
No.
Because it's low fatigue, it's high value to the athlete if they get better in it. Even if they get marginally better at it, it's hugely beneficial to them. So I don't have any problem with this. This isn't a problem.
Also, in terms of fine motor skills, those throwing and catching drills are really important. The other thing they help to develop is peripheral vision. So we oftentimes think about peripheral vision just being this kind of static skill we have. It's like our normal vision straight ahead. We think that if you have to wear glasses, you have to wear glasses forever. If you start to develop your peripheral vision, your reaction times in peripheral vision tasks can go down fairly significantly. So that's why you will see rugby players doing a lot of peripheral vision catch drills. You'll see soccer players doing peripheral vision ball handling drills, except with their feet and not with their hands.
And I think sometimes people make the mistake of thinking kind of hand-eye coordination stuff is innate and it can't be trained. So even the worst person can get a little bit better, and someone talented like Wonderboy Thompson, for example, can certainly get better. And 2% improvement is a huge improvement for a lot of this stuff. So it always pays to be working on it. So there's literally no reason not to do it. So don't forget, if you are some kind of combat sport athlete, any of this kind of hand-eye coordination stuff, skill, drill, reaction time stuff should definitely be trained.
It's interesting when you see these kind of drills. A lot of this stuff, you would have seen it in early 2000s, right? But most of the stuff they would have concentrated on is really hardcore training, hardcore conditioning, lifting weights. It's all the tough cunt mentality.
Mm-hmm.
Then you start seeing Ido Portal and these people coming into the area an awful lot more, and they get this kind of hippy dippy name, where it's oh no, we're not about lifting weights, we're just about stability and all this core strength. A lot of what they're training and the value of their training is that fine motor skill, coordination, reaction time reduction. This stuff is heavily backed up by science, yet it gets this kind of name of being an alternative stream of training because the people look like kind of yoga instructors.
Unfortunately as well, a little bit, it seems like from the other stuff you can see they've gone too far in the kind of nuanced and technical direction in terms of training and tried to make things overly complicated. So there is a balance in between, in the middle, where you do heavy conditioning, intense training, but with a little bit of this stuff, but with far smarter training modalities and programs. So this is where the problems kind of come in, and this is where the example of what kind of a lot of athletes do. So we're watching, setting up to do hang power cleans with straps. Obviously that's a huge no-no for athletes. That is just, skilled weightlifters have broken their wrists doing that, very, very skilled weightlifters. Hang power cleans are great. I don't have a problem with these. So then we see him move into a superset. So we're going from a high velocity power movement to a strict strength movement. So single arm dumbbell bench. Again, nothing wrong with the individual exercise.
No, dumbbell bench, single arm especially, is absolutely perfect in this case. Just to go back to the power clean, you've got a power clean being done in bare feet, which is obviously limiting the amount of power you're going to get in that catch. So in the amortization phase, one of the main reasons you want someone to have shoes on when they're catching a barbell is it will allow them to put more force into the floor. What's happening when you get a bare foot landing on the ground, a lot of the time you'll get the bare heel landing on the ground, and obviously the more impact we have, that gives an afferent nerve signal back, and it limits the amount of muscle contraction we have. So it would be like me standing in front of a wall asking myself to punch that wall as hard as possible. As soon as I kind of hit that wall once, that afferent nerve signal, usually in the form of pain, will feed back up through my peripheral nervous system into my central nervous system, and the next time I swing to hit the wall, it won't be as strong a contraction, or the punch won't be as powerful. So it's the exact same thing when we do power cleans in our bare feet. Once we hit the ground kind of once or twice in a very, very kind of impactful or forceful way, we're not going to have the same speed in the pull under. The second thing is he's using the wrong straps as well, so he shouldn't be using straps, and he's using lasso straps for a power clean, just to nitpick a bit.
So then we see move on to V-ups again, which is nothing wrong with V-ups. A little bit of weighted V-ups is no problem, okay? But the problem we have...
5 rounds just like a fight, but within those 5 rounds, I got to do 3 sets of everything. So I just went through my first set of the
So we can
the
see
hand cleans.
this is the main problem. Everything is done in like circuits, everything is rounds, everything is a conditioning thing. Everything is forced into this conditioning aspect. They're making all of their training conditioning. So you see, he just said there he has to do 5 rounds, and then he has to do 3 sets of each of those in a round. It's so ineffective, and it's ruining the training. And there's nothing wrong with the actual training he's doing. Like hang power cleans would be fine, bar the little things Fitz talking about. V-ups are fine. Single arm dumbbell bench press would be totally fine, okay? When you think about it, fighters have, and all athletes have, 3 kind of main areas they need to focus on. But we'll just talk about fighters for a second. So we've high force movements. So that would be stuff like he's benching, preferably barbell bench, something like that. He's deadlifting, strict press. So slow movements that require high force and heavy weights. Then we've like velocity based training, and to a certain extent under that umbrella we've things like power development. So we've got things like his sprints, maybe things like his plyometrics. I would put hang power cleans in there. And then we've conditioning for athletes, okay? So conditioning is separate. What we often see is we see all of these 3 different things mashed into each other, okay? And when you think about it like this, so if we have these 3 different aspects, we've force training, we've our kind of velocity power development, and we've our conditioning, all of these negatively make each other worse when forced into this one training session, into one training circuit. So high force training looks like lower reps, a large amount of rest between sets. We're talking 2 or 3 minutes. Real emphasis on quality over quantity for most of that training. We have a lot of rest between those. We need really good quality reps, and we're looking for a maximum ability with those weights. So we need to be actively looking to use heavier weights to force more force production, no pun intended. So you're looking for as much, to facilitate as much as you can of a quality training session, and look for heavier weights as much as you can, and any kind of power stuff mixed in with that, any velocity stuff mixed in with that, definitely any conditioning stuff mixed in with that in that same training session only degrades the quality of movement, erodes your rest time, forces you not to be able to use as heavy weights because you're just going to be fatigued from the other stuff. So then if you look at your high velocity movements, so when we're doing for high velocity stuff, and we'll see in a minute, he's doing like plyometric push-ups, the speed or the muscle fibers recruited is solely and almost exclusively dictated by the speed of movement. So not the intent you have by the movements, not by how loud your coach is shouting at you, the type 2X, type 2A or type 1 fibers, whatever's recruited is only dictated by the speed of movement. So the speed which his arm moves dictates the fibers used, not his intention behind that solely. So if he's trying to move fast, but if he's fatigued and he ends up moving slow, he is training the incorrect muscle fibers along with a few other CNS interactions. So he's effectively training himself to be slow. So then we would have stuff like that where we see some plyometric push-ups, we see his hang power cleans. And then if you think about your conditioning is stuff done like bikes.
Yeah, a lot of the time with conditioning you want steady state across things, so it's consistent. Even if it's like HIIT training, high intensity interval training, you're looking for an elevated heart rate, elevated cardiovascular values across an entire session. When you start moving or bringing things that are a bit more complicated, a bit more high force in, so example, if you've deadlifts in a conditioning session and the deadlifts are too heavy for the session, if you're doing like intervals and circuits are perfect for conditioning training, but if you bring something that's too kind of power intensive or too force intensive in there, you suddenly drop off. So the good example of this might be 400 meter runs with some burpees, some box jumps, and some deadlifts in that workout. If I want as a coach to keep someone elevated the entire time, if that deadlift is too heavy, right, or if the deadlift is in any way heavy, like any way effectively heavy to train some sort of strength or power movement, I'm then going to slow down when I get to the deadlifts, and I lose the sharpness of that cardiovascular kind of output. That's why ergs are so good for cardio work. That's why getting someone on a bike out on the road is so good for cardio work. It's because you can really control the output and the inputs as well, but you really control the output. You keep someone elevated for a long, long time. For cardio work, if you're looking at actual cardiovascular training, you're looking at 20 minutes at minimum for those sessions. So like there's things that happen when we're looking for adaptations in the cardiovascular realms that don't happen when you start slowing it down with very complicated movements in a circuit, but also high force or kind of just high priority movements mixed in there.
So then we'll move on. Again, another set of circuits here. We've got front squats, fat grip chin-ups, and different kind of V-ups. So again, front squats be phenomenal for a fighter. Fat grip chin-ups would be great for a fighter. Any kind of core work would be great for a fighter. But we're mashing all this into one training session after an already fatiguing set of a conditioning circuit before this, basically, because it's not effective strength training. Basically what this is like doing is, if you imagine this, right, so I would say he's done 4 sessions on this board, a week's worth of training into basically one session. This is the equivalent of taking 50,000 calories for the week or whatever he's eating and eating them all on a Monday, and then he's saying again nothing till the next Monday. So you can see how that doesn't make any sense, how that's not going to be an effective manner with which you're going to do your training sessions.
I think it's also important to note as well that it looks like he's done all his week's training in one session, but then if you were to break those down into our different silos, like Gerf talked about, the force stuff, the power stuff, and the conditioning stuff, he's probably done a quarter of what he actually needs to do in a session in this session, you know. So there's not enough strength work, there's not enough power work, and there's not cardio work in there, yet it's all being mixed into one and kind of diluted down.
Right, so then the next strength conditioning sin number 4 or whatever, we should do something like cinema sins, you know those, you ever watch them?
Cinema sins.
So fucking good. No. So they'll point out mistakes and stuff in movies.
Oh, I love those.
Great YouTube.
Yeah.
So next we're on is we've got plyometric push-ups. Nothing particularly wrong with those. Again, in a particular situation they'd be useful. But then we've got a mix with rear delt flies and something else with med ball slams, okay? So there's kind of like 2 things wrong with this. So the main one is, again, when we're looking at high skill movements, high velocity movements, these degrade really quickly. So we always want to be doing these as fresh as possible. So these should be first in a session, preferably a separate session when the athlete is fresher, not after 2 rounds of high force as heavy weight as you can manage kind of circuit training. This just highly degrades the quality. These are no longer power development movements. These are effectively just conditioning movements.
Yeah. I think a really good rule is like your prioritization of movements should go with that force velocity curve, and it should also go with the kind of level of skill, as Gerf was talking about, of the movement. So if you imagine, we've talked about force velocity curves a lot on this channel. Up here you've got really high velocity, low force movements. Start your sessions there. So they're like plyometric training, sprint training, maybe low box jumps landing almost fully standing up, plyometric push-ups, your anti-rotation work, your lateral ball slams we see here. Next thing, you creep down lower, and that might be the hang power cleans we see in that session. That happens next. Then you creep down lower, that becomes your front squats as we just saw. And then we finish up with like our isometric work, our core work that you're seeing in this session.
So the fifth strength conditioning sin of this would then be is pairing these high skill, high velocity movements with a fatiguing, hypertrophic kind of basically isolation exercise with rear delt flies. So doing these in a circuit is just making you more fatigued, so it's making you less likely to recruit the correct muscle fibers and move at the correct speed because you're fatigued, and that's dampening the effect of your plyometric push-ups and your med ball slams. So again, you're just turning this into essentially a CrossFit WOD, which is great if he was doing CrossFit, but he's not. He's certainly not.
This is, and then there's some like barbell curls and stuff.
They're okay. Like there's nothing like finishing off a session with like fat grip curls and rotational stuff is fine. Like it's nothing. Probably the last main like sin would be the stability training. Okay, so
this is, to be honest, I think this is one of the most egregious sins in terms of things people wouldn't think about. Like everyone knows about the more complicated and faster movements at the start of a session, then moving on to slower and less complicated movements. The stability stuff is people really, really get mixed up and turned around on this. When we're looking to train stability, as the same way when we're looking to train speed, we want to ensure we're working towards stable positions. So if I have somebody and I get them to stand on a med ball and they're never really able to get stable, they're doing absolutely F all to get better at being stable. They're just practicing being unstable a lot. Most of the time, when we want someone to be very, very good at being stable, you need to ensure that they're working towards a stable position. So if we had somebody who's working towards a stable position and they're in a rotational state, what that might look like is you get them standing on 2 feet, nice, solid, maybe in a power position. You would get someone throwing a ball to them from the side, so that might be a 6 or an 8 kilo med ball. They would receive that ball, and as they receive the ball, they're then becoming more stable. Another example would be you'd get someone with a bottoms up kettlebell press. They're standing in a stable position. As they put force into that kettlebell, they're having to work to make sure that kettlebell stays stable, and then they lock it out in a stable overhead position again. Everything you're doing is working towards being more stable. Like a sprinter, sprinting fast and wanting to sprint faster, you don't get sprinters to sprint through puddles of treacle or sand pits to try and make them faster. You do facilitative movements to make them more fast, and in this case you want to do facilitative movements to make them more stable. The reason a lot of this shite came out and about the place is because when you get people recovering from certain kinds of injury, you have to train proprioception. And proprioception is the ability of us to perceive where our limbs are or where our body is in space without visual or kinesthetic feedback. So if I put my hand behind my back here, I can tell that my fist is closed, or I can tell that my elbow is starting to lock out without seeing it or without feeling some sort of kinesthetic feedback. What happens in an injury context, and when we have someone who might have a neural injury or they might have a change in a tendon length, so they no longer have that feedback loop, it's when they start to retrain that movement, they retrain it by a trial and error method. So in a similar way where when a baby is learning how to pick something up, they'll reach out and touch something, and then you'll kind of see them pulling their hand back. The next time they reach out and pull something, they'll pull their hand back, and they gradually get this idea through a trial and error method of, when I feel this means my hand is out here. It's the same reason a child will often miss putting food into their mouth, or they'll end up with food all around their mouth, which you technically wouldn't see an adult doing that often, although it does happen. This kind of retraining goes through so it's simple trial and error feedback. I try A, do I get A back? I try B, do I get B back? In the injury rehabilitation setting, when we're retraining proprioception, we need to do kind of instability movement like this, because we only get that by going through multiple ranges of motion. So in the example of an injured or broken ankle, the final step in our recovery, once we've built strength and once we've built mobility in the ankle, is you'll often see some sort of balance board movement and things like this. That's basically bringing us into ranges of motion that we wouldn't usually bring that ankle through. And then we're getting that kind of A test, B test scenario where we're learning through trial and error. In the case of an athlete who's incredibly skilled in proprioception, we're now training instability into them, and we're getting basically nothing from any of this.
So I think probably what the issue with stability training came from, or where people assumed it would come from, is, so for example, when you are looking for an increase in strength, you would push yourself and then you would see some kind of adaptation, and then you end up stronger following weeks, or in terms of hypertrophy training or strength movements or whatever, maybe conditioning the same. Unfortunately, skilled movements like this don't work that way. There's no super compensation for skills. You don't train yourself in an unstable environment, and then suddenly when you get to a stable environment, your body goes, oh fuck, I'm way more stable. I remember what instability was like. You know, there's this idea that you're like training the smaller muscles or the stabilizer muscles, wherever those may be. That it's an unfortunate leap of logic, and looking from the outside, it seems like it possibly would make sense. But unfortunately, experience and research has shown that that is not the case. So the only person standing on a Bosu ball is effective for is potentially an employee of an inflatable pool who is working on those things. Other than that, it doesn't really do much, unfortunately. I think they're all our S&C combats sins. Do you want to touch something else?
So the last thing, he finishes off with some ladder drills. To be honest, I really like ladder drills. Just to reiterate, they shouldn't be done at the end of a session when someone is fatigued, because you're trying to build good motor patterns, fast motor patterns, agile motor patterns. In terms of general populations, if you're the people watching this video, you're saying, should I use some ladder drills? For weightlifters and powerlifters, being agile with your feet is incredibly valuable. Also, for aging populations, being agile with your feet is really, really important to avoid falls and things like that. So if you are somebody who commonly walks a barbell out of a squat rack, being a small bit lighter on your feet, being able to deal with some sort of inconsistencies on a platform, or even a failed rep where you might have to take a step forward, a few ladder drills built into your warm-up might be a very valuable thing.
If you are a combat sports athlete, and we're not talking about a soldier, I mean combat sports, MMA, jiu-jitsu, judo, for example, we do have a 10-week strength program. It's focused on strength. It's some power development at the end. It's 4 sessions a week. I promise you, it will make you a better man or woman in your combat sports. We won't lead you astray. If you're looking for an example of a good S&C conditioning video, we did one on Ono Shea, a judo athlete. He's currently the winner. He won the Olympics in the 73 kilo category in judo, and he's a fucking monster, and he's a phenomenal example of what great S&C work is. So kudos to his coaches. Thanks for watching. If there's any other athletes or sports you want us to do, just leave it in the comments and we'll get to it.